Well, good morning. Come on in, have a seat, and we will get our class started. This is our last class, so appreciate you all sticking with us for the full quarter. You got some good teachers coming up next quarter. So we're going to conclude our lessons out of the book of Matthew today, and I want to thank you all for the just words of encouragement over the course of the quarter. It's been very welcome. But I also need to apologize this morning because I didn't get to. I ran out a little bit of time and didn't make any slides this week. So you're actually going to have to open up your own Bibles today. So open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 27. That's where we're going to spend the duration of our class. So as we talked last week, we went through obviously the last several weeks we've been going through the trials, and we ended off last week talking about the scourge, the Roman scourge, and the flogging that Jesus had endured. And today we get to the point where he is now being put on the cross. So we're going to start in Matthew chapter 27 in verse 32. And it says this: "As they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. They came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. There they offered Jesus wine to drink mixed with gall, but after tasting it, he refused to drink it." So again, Jesus is, after the first trial he had in front of the Sanhedrin, that was a trial under Jewish law. Eventually he gets taken to Pilate, and he's eventually sentenced to death under Roman law. So under Roman law, he would have been required to carry his own cross to Golgotha, which is where they would have these executions. And we talked a little bit last week, the process of the flogging and the scourging, and obviously the immense physical toll that it put on a person. And so Jesus was physically, his body was no longer able to carry that cross. And so they actually, as Matthew says, they force this man, his name is Simon of Cyrene, to carry Jesus' cross. And Simon, it says he's from Cyrene. Do we know where Cyrene is? Cyrene is actually was formed as a Greek colony in Africa, the northern part of Africa, in modern-day Libya. But at this point in time, it's under Roman control. And Cyrene apparently had a pretty robust Jewish population at this point in time. And given that his name is Simon, we can probably assume that he is, in fact, Jewish. Whether he was born Jewish or converted Jewish, we're not really sure. But most likely he was just there. He was in town because of the Passover. And so he was at the right place at the right time and was given a very particular and very impactful type of job. The type of job that's probably going to change you a little bit, I would imagine. Mark's account records a similar story, but it mentions that he was the father of Alexander and Rufus. And I always I always like those kind of random details. Why are we including his kids' names? Again, the book of Matthew is typically geared towards, or historically believed to have been written towards, the Jewish population. Mark's account was more written for the Romans, so it's possible that he included the names of Simon's sons because they may have been well known to the Romans. We don't really know, but I always like those kind of special details. But Matthew says that they take him to a place called Golgotha. Now, Golgotha is the Aramaic name of a hill outside of Jerusalem where these executions would have taken place. And Golgotha in the Aramaic is essentially the word for skull in Aramaic. But it comes from the Hebrew word for skull, which is Gulgaleth. So that's the Hebrew word. Now, historical records outside of the Bible verify that there was a place called Golgotha that they would take people to be executed or crucified. Nobody really knows exactly where that is today. A lot of people speculate. If you go to Jerusalem today, there are tours that will tell you exactly where this place happened, but we don't really officially know where this event took place. But Matthew notes, in addition to calling it Golgotha, he mentions that it is in fact called the place of the skull. In the Greek, it says the place of the cranion, which is, we get the word cranium from that word. Now, where do we get the term Calvary? You know, we sing a lot of songs when we're talking about the cross and Jesus on the cross, and we don't very often sing songs about a hill called Golgotha. We sing songs about a hill called Mount Calvary. Where does the term Calvary come from? The only time the word shows up in the Bible is in Luke chapter 23, verse 33, and it only shows up if you have a certain version of the Bible. And by my research on this, it's the King James and New King James version that use the term Calvary. Most versions will say Golgotha or just the place of the skull. And Calvary comes from the Latin word Calvaria, which is the Latin word for skull. And of course, a lot of the King James would have taken certain translations from the Latin rather than just a direct translation from the original text. We talked, I think, in our class when we were talking about the Beatitudes. The term beatitude or beatus is a Latin word for blessedness. So the translators of the New King James or the King James Version stuck with the term Calvary. But just as a little bit of a recap, we're talking all about the same thing. Golgotha is the Aramaic term, Gulgaleth is the Hebrew term, cranion is the Greek term, and Calvary is the Latin term, which derives from the Latin Vulgate translation. So why did they have to go to Golgotha to do this execution? I mean, obviously he wasn't sentenced at this place. He was sentenced somewhere within the city, and then they go outside the city to do this execution or the crucifixion. And the reason for that is executions were forbidden to take place within the city walls. Again, we go through all these sham trials, all these kind of oversteps of justice, but you know what? We have standards. We're not going to do this within the city walls. We're going to take it outside the city walls. And there's also some debate as to why they called this the place of the skull. I think we can all probably gather that this is a place of death. Seems pretty easy to make that comparison. A lot of people will tell you that the hill that this was located on had a resemblance of a skull. That's more of a tourism thing, I think, more than anything. But obviously this was a place of great death. And that's where Jesus is placed on the cross. And we're not going to go into all the specific details of crucifixion specifically, but I think we're all familiar with what that looked like. But in verse 34 of Matthew chapter 27, it tells us that Jesus is offered wine mixed with gall, but he refuses to drink it. Mark's account says wine mixed with myrrh. And we've talked a little bit about myrrh in this class. That's one of the kind of elements or the items that was given to Jesus at his birth. It had some medicinal qualities to it. But it's a little bit interesting because on its face, gall and myrrh are not really the same thing. Some connotations may tend to go that way. The word in the Greek for gall, though, is kole, which by definition is bile from a liver. But it also can mean just in general bitterness or bitter herbs. So sometimes they would say, we're going to have wine mixed with gall. It just means it's bitter. It has bitter herbs or bitter elements to it. But in the context of crucifixion, the offering of bitter wine was customary, and it was intended to help dull the pain. And there would often be women or groups who showed sympathy to the criminals on the cross, and they would offer this wine mixed with gall or mixed with myrrh as a way to help ease their pain as they're suffering. But it notes that Jesus tasted it, but then refuses to drink it further. And we don't really know why. A lot of people speculate that Jesus is taking on the sins of the world. He doesn't want to ease that pain, ease that suffering. But we don't specifically know. Maybe the taste was just so bitter that he didn't want to bear it. But then we go to verse 35, and it says, when they had crucified him. Now, keep in mind, when you're reading in the text and it says, when they crucified him, that, I've often just associated that word with killing or with death. And the crucifying is the actual process of being on the cross. So when they had crucified him, once he was on the cross, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. And then it says, sitting down, they kept watch over him there. So the soldiers are there, and they're casting lots to figure out who's going to keep his garments. And this concept of casting lots shows up a lot in the Bible. I think I went a very long time without really kind of knowing exactly what that meant. I kind of got an idea that, this is something that people would do to try to figure out kind of a random outcome. But essentially what it is they would take objects, or literally kind of like rolling dice in a way. They would take objects and throw them. They would cast these lots, and they would call them a lot that they would cast. And it could be pebbles, it could be stones, it could be sticks, it could be coins, it could really be anything they had available to them. But they would kind of turn it into somewhat of a game. It's almost like a kind of an ancient version of rock, paper, scissors. It was a way to make a random determination to determine a certain outcome. Now, do you ever think that they would cast lots and the loser would say, how about best 2 out of 3? And I say that in jest because it really, it's one of these, you read through the story and a lot of anger kind of burns up within you in a lot of ways. And it frustrates me that Jesus is going through what he's going through and they're literally playing games to figure out who's going to keep his clothes. But that's what they are doing. Now, Mark's account mentions that there was 4 soldiers doing this, and they split it up into four different parts. Now, we also know that the casting of lots for Jesus' clothes is a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. In Psalm 22, starting in verse 16, it says this: dogs, and this is a psalm written by David. It says, dogs surround me, a pack of villains encircles me. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garments. So again, another Old Testament prophecy, once again fulfilled by Jesus' enemies. People that would have no interest in fulfilling these prophecies are the ones who are actually fulfilling the prophecies. Mark's account, Mark 15, verse 23 says, when the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing them into 4 shares. I mentioned this just a minute ago. 1 for each of them, with the undergarment remaining. This garment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. Let's not tear it, they said. Let's decide who gets it by lot. So again, they're casting lots to figure out who gets to keep Jesus' clothes. But then we get to verse 37. Matthew 27:37 says this: above his head was placed a written charge against him. This is Jesus, King of the Jews. 38 says 2 rebels were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Now Matthew tells us this sign is placed over his head, and it reads his charge, which is the fact that he was claiming to be a king, specifically King of the Jews. And we know that this sign was placed there at the direction of Pilate, and that this sign was intended to be a form of mockery, and also intended to be somewhat ironic. Again, from Pilate's perspective, you have Jesus, who he had met with, and remember, Pilate had asked him, are you saying that you are a king? And his response was what? My kingdom is not of this world. So he was claiming to be a king, and Pilate wanted to mock him for that. But I think the irony, or at least from Pilate's perspective, was that this was a means to show that a self-professed king being stripped and executed in public view. And it's also a way to mock Jesus for this kingdom that he was claiming to be the king of, that Jesus had professed to Pilate beforehand. But you have to think from Pilate's perspective, this act of crucifixion was a way to shut down this kingdom. This kingdom that Jesus says, my kingdom's not of this world, and Pilate said, okay, well, we're going to crucify you, and this kingdom's going to be no more. So in Pilate's mind, he's doing this kind of final termination of this kingdom that Jesus would be the king over. And obviously, Pilate, in his own ignorance, is completely unaware of this is actually forming, it's the foundation of the greatest kingdom this world is ever going to know. But Pilate is too ignorant to pick up on that. Now, John's account in John chapter 19, verse 20 says that this sign was written in a couple different languages. It mentions that it's written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. Now, why do you suppose it's in different languages? They're trying to make a statement. They're trying to make a statement. They want anyone who's in town for the Passover, regardless of what language you speak, they wanted to mock Jesus in 3 different languages. John's account also mentions that the chief priest actually protested. They did not want this sign to be hung over Jesus' head because it labeled him as a king, specifically king over them, king over the Jews. But Pilate answered in John chapter 19, verse 22, "I have written what I have written." Those are the words of a man that is under the impression that he is in control. And obviously we've discussed at great length Pilate and the fact that he is in no control at all. Also mentioned here in Matthew is that Jesus is accompanied by two other criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Matthew calls them rebels in Matthew's account, but the word itself in the Greek is the word leistes, and it literally just means a robber or a bandit or a thief. Not typically the type of charge that we would associate with requiring a painful death penalty. And I would love to know more about their background and their history of what got them to where they are right now. But we don't know. But we do know that they were thieves. But it's difficult for me to put into, because I don't want to surprise anyone here. I've never been to prison. So it's hard for me to really put myself in the mindset of somebody who's in a position like this. It's hard to really put yourself in the position of these guys and try to put yourself in what they're thinking at this very moment of these two gentlemen. You read stories about people who are in prison, and regardless of kind of the background, the history, the number one thing on a prisoner's mind is, how am I going to get out? When am I going to get out? What is it going to be like when I get out? It's this clinging to a hope of something of future prospect that keeps you motivated. Most prisoners will tell you that hope is what keeps them sane. That's what keeps them going. They wake up in the morning realizing the predicament that they're in, but the prospect of getting out one day, of knowing that there's something better than the situation they're in right now, is what keeps them motivated. And what often happens is, as time passes, that hope slowly starts to get chipped away. And people in prison will often, have psychotic breaks, or they'll go crazy because they don't have that hope anymore. That hope has been lost. So you think of these two criminals, they're already on the cross, they're hanging there, they're all in the same position. Any hope of a possible escape is non-existent. The only thing they're ever going to know for the rest of their short life is what is on that cross. And, they'll never take another step. They're hanging on a cross. They'll never use their feet again. They'll never eat another meal. They'll never have another view beyond what they're looking at that very moment. They'll never feel the embrace of a hug of a family member or a friend. And it's interesting because these two guys have a very different perspective on what that means for them. And Matthew's account doesn't go into great detail about these criminals, but Luke's account does. So if you want to flip over to Luke chapter 23, we're going to be there for just a minute. So Luke chapter 23, and I'm going to start reading from verse 39. And it says, one of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at Jesus. He says, "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." Now again, the people on the ground are also mocking Jesus, saying very similar things, and this criminal decides to join in with the crowds against the individual to his side. Now he says, "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." So what is this criminal looking for? What is he trying to accomplish at this very moment? And I would suggest that he is seeking salvation. But what is he seeking salvation from? He's seeking salvation from his predicament that he's in, from his sentence. He's seeking salvation from his pain, from his agony. He's seeking salvation from this impending death that he knows is about to take place. And that manifests itself into mockery. And he goes in with the mobs and is saying the exact same things they're saying. He says, aren't you the Messiah? Do something about it. If you are who you say you are, do something about it. But what does the other criminal say? Luke 23, verse 40 says this, "But the other criminal rebuked him. 'Don't you fear God?' he said, 'since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong.'" So he's on the cross. One of them, I don't know which guy was on the left, which one was on the right. We don't really know. But I kind of pictured that this guy is hanging there, and he's hearing this guy on the other side of Jesus, and he's mocking Jesus. And he steps in, and he decides to give his 2 cents, and he tells this man that I rebuke you. Don't you know what's happening here? Don't you see who this is? He's done nothing wrong. And the text doesn't say this, but I imagine that he turns his gaze from the other prisoner, and he turns and he faces Jesus. And he looks at Jesus and he says, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Remember me. And what does Jesus say back to him? He says, truly I tell you today you will be with me in paradise. What is this criminal seeking? He's also seeking salvation, but a very different kind of salvation. And for whatever circumstances, whatever providence of God you want to call it, that gets this criminal to this place at this very specific moment, he sees his opportunity and he takes it. And he recognizes who Jesus is, and he recognizes him as the Son of God. And he looks at Jesus and he says, remember me. Kind of gets you a little bit emotional. Because that's us. We are that criminal. And we're looking at Jesus and we're saying, remember me. And he's looking back at us and saying, you will be with me in paradise. But remember that Pilate placed that sign above Jesus' head, and it said, King of the Jews. And the purpose of that sign, as we talked about, was to proclaim that Jesus was the king over a kingdom that did not exist. But this criminal proclaims that Jesus' kingdom was about to come. All these people in the crowd, Pilate, chief priests, everyone's ignorant. But that criminal recognizes who Jesus is. And he looks at him and he says, remember me, and Jesus complies. Can you even begin to imagine the level of calm that came over that man in that moment? He is literally hanging on a tree on the verge of suffocating. But I can imagine that is the ultimate peace that nobody has ever felt. The prospect of death no longer impacting his thought processes. Can you just imagine letting everything go in that moment? Because Jesus, the King and Savior, looks at him and says, you're going to be with me in paradise. When? Today. It's a lot to take in. But again, this is another example of our salvation not coming from our actions, but again, coming from the grace of God through our faith. I think it's easy for us to look at and say, why, of all people in the history of the world, does that criminal get to hear that directly from the mouth of Jesus? But again, our faith drives our salvation through grace, not our actions. But again, while all this is going on, Jesus is being mocked by the people on the ground. They hurled insults at him, they spit on him, and they mock him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. Going back to Matthew chapter 27, in verse 39 it says, those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God. In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law and the elders mocked him. He saved others, but can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him. He said, for he said, I am the Son of God. So again, they're mocking. If you recall, in his trials, in the trial in front of the Sanhedrin, the charge and the kind of the allegation that the two witnesses couldn't necessarily agree on was this concept that Jesus had said that he was going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. And so they're taking the elements that were discussed in that trial and they're mocking Jesus for it. But in other words, I hear them saying in a very simple way, if he is who he says he is, this should not be a difficult task for him. If you are the Messiah, do something about it. Pull yourself down from the cross. But also bear in mind the tone of the chief priests when they say, come down from there and we'll believe you. It sounds kind of like an ultimatum. Come down there and we'll believe you. I'll believe you, but only on my terms. Do what I say and I'll believe you. This is what they're saying. But recall What prompted all of this? If you recall back, and we talked about it in here, before they had arrested Jesus, there was a conversation that took place, and John records it, John chapter 11, verse 48. And the chief priests had gotten together, and they basically say this, and this is John 11:48. If we let him go on like this, talking about Jesus, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. So again, they're terrified of losing the power that they have. So from their point of view, they're solving a problem. And it's interesting because Jesus... Let me back up just a minute. It's funny when you look at the tone of the people that are saying all these things. And they're saying, come down from there and I'll believe you. They're mocking him, hailing him King of the Jews. It reminds me a lot of people today. And specifically people, and I call them keyboard warriors. People that get on social media and say very bold and unsubstantiated things. People tend to get really bold when they can convince themselves that there's no repercussions to the things that they're going to say. And I say it reminds me of people online because you can get on, you can create a fake account, you can have a real account. But if I'm talking and I get into an argument with somebody that lives in Seattle, what are they going to do about it? You know what I mean? And you have all these people on the ground, and they're mocking Jesus, and he's on the cross, and they're saying these vile and disgusting things because in their mind, nothing he can do about it. But then what is Jesus' response to all of this? In Luke 23:34, he says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. So again, all of this is happening, and Jesus' response to it is forgive them. And he says they don't know what they're doing, and that is 100% true. They don't know what they're doing. But if you were to go ask them specifically, imagine you're an interviewer, and you're in the crowd, you're watching this, and you go up to one of the chief priests and you said, Mr. Chief Priest, do you know what you're doing right now? What would their response be? Absolutely, I know what I'm doing right now. I am solving a problem. I'm alleviating a threat to my power. And again, the conversation from John chapter 11:48 comes to mind. They are solving a problem, and they are making that problem go away, but only from the point of their ignorant point of view. They don't have the ability to see the implications beyond this very moment. And as we've talked in here, could Jesus have escaped? Yes, but also no, because our entire plan of salvation, God's entire plan of salvation hinged on the death of a perfect lamb, a blameless sacrifice. So he endured so that we could in fact live. So then we get to Matthew 27 and verse 45, and it says, from noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. Did it just get darker in here? That was kind of weird. Gotta check that. But this is the NIV translation. The actual text says from the 6th hour until the 9th hour. And again, they would have calculated their time hours-wise from the from the time of sunup, from sunlight. So 6 hours from sunlight, probably around 6 a.m. 6 hours from that would have been noon. So the translators of the modern versions will help translate that. But again, from noon until 3, it says darkness came over the land. Again, noon until 3. That's a pretty bright time of the day. Very bright, the brightest. But here Matthew says darkness fell on the land. Now the word darkness here in the Greek is the word skotos, and it's kind of similar to English in the sense that it has multiple meanings. So the word means literal physical darkness. It is dark in here. It is skotos in here. I can't see anything, skotos. But it also means moral darkness. So like that person has a skotos to them. They have a darkness. There's a dark side to them. Ephesians 5 and 11, when it says have nothing to do with fruitless deeds of darkness, it's the same word. And it's easy to see that word and both of its meanings have heavy implication to the situation that we're looking at here, and it's relevant to our story. Obviously, there is a darkness that's taking place, a physical darkness, but Beyond that, this is the darkest hours in the history of our world. But it's also interesting that the word for land here, when it says darkness came over the land, the word in the Greek is gay, and it means earth, soil, land, region, country. It has numerous different meanings. So in Matthew chapter 5, when it said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," that's the word we're using here. Whenever you see a reference in the Bible to heaven and earth, that's the word we're using here. But it also literally just refers to dirt in the ground. I dug a hole in the ground. It's the same word. So there's a lot of different kind of perspectives on what specifically that might mean. I think most of my life, I just kind of assumed it was kind of a regionalized darkness to this very specific area. But based upon the word that's used, you could also interpret it that this was a worldwide event. But we don't know specifics on that. However, we do know that Luke's account uses some different phrasing, which is kind of interesting. So Luke 23, verse 45 says, "The sun stopped shining." Some versions may say the sun's light failed, which to me indicates that this was a pretty widespread event. Kind of an interesting thought anyway, but a few weeks ago we talked a little bit about Jesus' authority, and he has, how much authority does he have? All the authority. And part of that all, encompassed within that all, is authority over all things related to nature. Specifically, we talked about the story of him calming the waves by speaking to the waves and rebuking them. And so it's interesting when we get to a point like this, and I almost imagine, and again, the text doesn't tell us this, but I like to kind of imagine that the sun was recognizing what was going on, and it dimmed its light and refused to shine in honor of its king. This was not just an event that had impacts on people, on humanity. This had impacts on every facet, every aspect of the world that we live in. So I just kind of like the thought that the sun was paying honor to our Lord by dimming its light. Now, this was also a fulfillment of prophecy in Amos chapter 8, verse 9. It says, "In that day, declares the sovereign Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight." So again, another prophecy being fulfilled from the Old Testament. Now, there's also some external sources, not a lot, but there are a few external sources outside of the Bible that actually refer to this hours of darkness. A couple historians have recorded elements of that. Most of them, however, chalk it up to an eclipse. They'll just say, well, that's kind of random. An eclipse happened right at this moment for 3 hours. But interestingly enough, this could not have technically been an eclipse. Well, I take that back. It could not have been a scientifically explained eclipse. I'll put it that way. Obviously, God could have decided to form an eclipse at that moment. It wouldn't have been an issue. But interestingly enough, the Passover, again, this was all taking place during Passover. Passover always takes place during a full moon. So the Passover was always held on the 14th day of the month Nishan. The first day of that month was at the first sighting of a new moon. So a new moon, for those of you who aren't familiar with your lunar cycles, that would be me as well. But a new moon is when the moon is between the earth and the sun. And this is the only time an eclipse can actually happen, because you have to have the moon coming in front between the earth and the sun, and that's what creates the blocking of the sun. But again, a lunar cycle usually is like 29 and a half days, something like that. So 14 days later, we're going to be on the other side of the cycle. So it was always going to be a full moon. So this would not be a scientifically explained eclipse. But also, we've all seen an eclipse. When was the last eclipse? We had one during the summer. In April. How long did that last? What, like 10, 15 minutes? Yeah, for like 10 minutes or so, real quick. So the idea that there was a scientifically explained eclipse for 3 hours, again, this was an event that was caused by God. This is an event caused by science, or that could be explained by science. So then we get to verse 46. Matthew 27, 46. And it says this. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing there heard this, they said, he's calling Elijah. Immediately, one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him. And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. So Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Do you feel like Jesus in this moment was questioning God? I think a lot of people read that, and it's almost like, why are you doing this to me? Why am I the one that has to endure this? And I really don't see that Jesus is questioning God in any way. This is actually a direct quote from, again, Psalm 22, a psalm by David. So Psalm 22, starting in verse 1, says this, and this is the words of David, and he's expressing anguish, he's in pain, he's in agony. And this is the words of David. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? So far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. By night I find no rest. Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. In you our ancestors put their trust. They trusted you, and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. So again, this psalm by David is absolutely a cry of anguish, but it is also a praise of victory. And I see more or less this is exactly what Jesus is saying. And obviously Jesus is undoubtedly experiencing tremendous physical pain right now. But I think more than just physical pain, he again is experiencing the toll of sin and separation from God for the first time. And this is creating an unbearable, unimaginable level of pain for him. But it's interesting the reaction that the crowd has. The crowd's immediate reaction to this is he's calling Elijah. Now, why exactly would they interpret all of this to say he's calling Elijah? So we know, and the people there probably would have known and been familiar with Elijah. Elijah's a very prominent character in the Old Testament. 2 Kings chapter 2, we know that Elijah was taken up into heaven by a whirlwind. He's one of the few people that didn't actually experience a physical death. He's taken up into heaven directly. And we also know, and they would have probably known as well, what Micah chapter 4 verse 5 says. And it says this, see, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before that great and dreadful day of the Lord coming. So I almost view this as, from their perspective, the people standing there and they're watching all this, that they probably recognize that the scriptures, according to prophecy, would tell you that Elijah coming back was almost a prerequisite for the Messiah. So if we're going to have a Messiah and he's going to come back, then obviously Elijah's got to come back first. And, they even had some traditions. Again, this was all happening during Passover. There was actually a very prominent tradition during this time where they would actually set up an extra place at their table just in case Elijah came back. Very similar to how we hang up stockings at Christmas. I kind of imagine that at this point in time, it kind of had lost some of its meaning. Do we know why we hang stockings over our fireplace? No, but we do it, and we do it every year. But for them, they had a tradition of laying out a separate place at their table just in case Elijah came back. So you have to think that they're mocking Jesus' claim to being the Messiah. And when he starts shouting the words of David, that in their mind, he's like, well, let's see what happens. Maybe Elijah's going to come back. That'd be interesting, huh? But what they don't realize is that Elijah already had come. And Elijah's name was John the Baptist. And Jesus point blank tells us in Matthew chapter 11, verse 14, that John was the Elijah that was to come. So that prerequisite has already been met. They were just too ignorant to see it. But in response to them believing that Jesus was in fact trying to call Elijah, it says in verse 48, immediately one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. And the rest said, now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him. So it's interesting. It's almost like they're trying to, well, hold on. Let's hold on. Let's see where this goes. Let's see where this takes us. Now, the second drink that's offered, John's account actually tells us that Jesus did receive this drink. And John's account also says that Jesus had just told them that he was thirsty. So this was also a response to that. But I mentioned the first drink offering that was given to him. In the Greek, that first offering, it says oinen, which was the Greek word for wine, mixed with kole, or wine mixed with bitterness, which we talked about. This was an offer to deaden the physical pain, a medicinal concoction with a bitter taste. And then the second offering, it's the Greek word oxos, which just means sour wine or vinegar. And apparently this was to them anyway, was a pleasant drink. It was a favorite amongst the commoners. It was a favorite amongst the soldiers. John's account mentioned that they just kind of had some laying around. So when Jesus starts to say these things, they're like, hey, let's give him something to drink. And they had it on hand. Apparently it was very cheap to make and relatively effective in quenching thirst. But the offering of this second drink offering almost seems like they're trying to keep Jesus conscious for a little while longer to see what happens. Seems like they may be a little bit curious after Jesus is crying out to God. But Jesus doesn't necessarily do that. In verse 50 it says, "And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. And they came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people." So Luke's account says that Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." John's account just says he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. But it was at that moment that the mission instigated by the chief priest was in fact accomplished. Despite all this egregious miscarriage of justice, the derailment of justice, Jesus breathes his last, and the Jewish leaders breathe a sigh of relief because they get to keep their power. They did what they wanted to do. They crucified Jesus. But it was also at that moment that a few other pretty interesting things happened. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, tombs broke open, and bodies of the dead were raised. Now, the temple curtain that was torn in two, this is not your, when I think of a curtain, I think of the curtains that are hanging in front of my windows in my house. I could rip those in two very easily. These particular curtains were described to have been about 40 cubits high and about 4 inches thick. Pretty sturdy. Josephus also says in his recordings that horses tied to each side could not pull the veil apart. So this isn't something that's just going to split by chance. And obviously there is a tremendous amount of symbolism with the idea of this curtain splitting in two. You go back to the Old Testament and you think of the Holy of Holies being divided by a curtain. And there was a separation between man and God. But now we have this new covenant, and that curtain is now ripped in two. That barrier has been ripped apart. But also we have this earthquake is happening. I personally, I've never been in an earthquake, so I don't know what that feeling is. But I've seen videos of people in an earthquake, and it's startling. It's scary. But we also have people being raised from the dead. That's unusual. Don't see that every day. But it's interesting that we have in verse 54, it says, "When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified, and they exclaimed, 'Surely he was the Son of God.'" Kind of came to that conclusion a little bit too late. Don't let that be you. Don't let that be you. Come to that conclusion a little bit late. They're witnessing all these things. They're beating Jesus. They're crucifying him. Darkness happens, earthquake happens, you look over there and you're like, why is Steve, I went to his funeral last week. Things are happening, and these are not coincidences. They're happening because God is causing them to happen. And the response from the centurion who's witnessing all this is he was terrified, and he says, surely he was the Son of God. And again, you go back and you kind of culminate all that with the past several weeks we've been talking about with all the trials and all these things that have been happening. And surely, I wish we had another class to kind of go into what happens next, but you have to put yourself in the shoes of the chief priests who are witnessing all this. Do you think any of them were like, maybe we made a mistake? I wish that was the case, but that's clearly not the case. And again, I would love to have another class to talk kind of through what happens next with the resurrection and all that, but we are out of time. So I appreciate you all being in the class, and I'm looking forward to next quarter and seeing what comes. So appreciate it. Thank you all.